Hello, good evening. Welcome back. Glad that you're joining me. We are sitting down to play a little bit more Stars Without Number solo instead of in a group context. As with the previous episode, I'm going to do a brief recap of what happened the last time that we were playing. And basically, we followed the brother Hannibal through his travels in the biosphere that he was exploring. He ran into a blind jackal and just about come an ace of dying, but he was able to cause the jackal to flee, and in the process, he was able to finish searching out the biosphere, and incredibly, he found the remains of his dead brother, who was long lost, and in the past they hadn't been able to find his remains. So Hannibal gave him a proper burial and also kept his brother's ring to take back as a keepsake. Along the way home, he ran into a traveler from another land, and you can get the details on that in the previous episode. In the next episode, I'm going to go into a little bit more details about him, so I'm not going to cover him too much. But in the process, he did meet a new stranger along the way, and yeah, now he's actually been able to make it back to safety, back to the Hanaklis biosphere. So Hannibal, despite the odds, because he definitely was not the most favored to survive the trials, he did make it back safely. And so now we're going to join his brother on his journey out of the biosphere into the tubes for his trials. And his name is Masenko, and we'll be joining him now. Masenko walked toward the Void Gate, which was his designated departure tube. Some of his fellow soldiers walked with him as a small crowd followed behind. His father had just given a brief speech to see them off. A quick look over his shoulder and his brother was just going out of sight. Hannibal didn't even look back. He wasn't exactly nervous. He'd been in the tubes many times before. In fact, the Void Gate was the one where he earned the scar that was over his left brow and cheek. He'd only went once through that gate, but once was enough. Thoughts and fears swirled through his head as he only half-heartedly listened to his friends. Masenko definitely was more popular than his brother, though his brother was extremely successful within the tribe. Masenko had spent his whole life exploring the three main tubes, scouting, ensuring trade between the confederations. It was a good life. Even at the age of 26, he felt like he had lived a life worth being proud of. That helped to give him courage for what he was about to do. Before long, he was at the airlock. His friend slapped him on the back and told him that they didn't want to go snake his corpse out of some abandoned biosphere, so he better come back. Masenko smiled without looking away from the airlock. He'd ventured out alone only a couple times and not very far. This time, it would be 3 days. 3 days, and he had a bold plan. He knew his brother had gotten the better end of the stick. The Golden Rim Gate was long abandoned just like the Void Gate, but the Void Gate tube had a reputation: darkness, despair, nightmares. That was what awaited those who ventured into it. What's more, Masenko had already accepted the fact that he would push further than anyone had ever done. Throwing caution to the wind, he would jog most of his traveling time. It was a huge risk. He may walk into a trap. He may be held up on the return trip and not be able to make it back in time. He may get lost by not being careful. It all added up to a terrible risk, but he knew that the only way that he would dissuade the chief from deciding his successor being his older brother, he needed to do something bold. Masenko grabbed the handle on the door and the operator unlocked the airlock. A mechanical click told him he could open the door. Mechanically, as he'd done so many times before, he was in the airlock donning his mask, opening the valve on the oxygen tank, checking his weapons. 3 days. He unhooked his bow from his back, nocked an arrow, and he stepped through the second door. Early morning on the first day. Because Masenko had chosen to travel so quickly, any notice checks that will be taken at a higher DC. I roll for the first encounter, which is a D6. I roll a 6. Masenko is moving at a quick pace. He isn't the strongest in the tribal warriors, but he is in very good shape and quick on his feet. By mid-morning, he decides to slow down a bit to catch up for some air. He's been jogging pretty steadily for a couple of hours by now. Now it's mid-morning on the first day. Another D6, I roll a 2. The pavement along the path is well built, and only a few weeds are peeking through what little cracks exist along the roadway and the tube. After an hour of walking, he starts to jog again. Shockingly, even to him, by lunchtime he's already at the first crossroads. He's familiar with this crossroad. The only other time he's ever been in here, he had turned to the right at the crossroad. Down that path, that's where he earned his scar. Not this time, though. He would travel straight. He was surprised at his speed. Last time it had taken him an entire day to get this far. Now he had done it by lunch. He definitely needed a rest as he knelt down and unloaded his pack to take a quick break. Early afternoon on the first day. Once more I roll a d6 for encounters. This time I roll a 1. As it is still the main road, Masenko continues to make good time by jogging off and on. The excitement of what this adventure means for him urges him ever forward. A night rat skitters from left to right across his path. Masenko skids to a halt, drawing his arrow to cheek without even thinking. He has been careless. He makes a mental note not to let his mind wander as he starts jogging once more. On the meta side, the encounter table I rolled for this event gives the character a boon, that he cannot be ambushed. Sweat is pouring down him at this point. Good thing he brought extra water in anticipation of this level of exertion. Late afternoon on the first day. As the sun's fleeing toward the horizon, Masenko comes across another crossroads, this time left, right, and straight ahead. He isn't sure which direction to go. He decides to do an old trick he learned while scouting the main tubes. He pulls his mask down off his nose and sniffs the air down each direction. A few sniffs won't hurt the body to any real degree. At least that's what he's always been told. For this situation, I do one of two things. First, I roll a d6 to see which direction he believes smells the worst. 1 and 2 is left, 3 and 4 straight, 5, 6 right. Straight ahead definitely smells the worst. Surely there is more treasure in that direction. Now, because he's already exerted himself quite a bit today, and also because he's been breathing toxic air, Masenko must make a physical saving throw. His saving throw for a physical is 14. I roll a 4. As Masenko puts his mask back on, he doesn't feel so good. His head's beginning to get a bit dizzy. Maybe he breathed in too deeply? Either way, he knows his direction and he starts continuing down the main road. I roll a d6 for an encounter, a 2. Although Masenko doesn't have any more events along the way while the sun is up, he doesn't jog anymore. He's beginning to doubt that he's made the right decision by pushing himself so hard, and the dizziness just wasn't going away. He gains a point of stress and triggers a panic check. 2 stress total. I roll a 2d10. And I roll a 17. Masenko shakes off his doubts, but decides that now is a good time for supper and to sleep. Unfortunately, there isn't really a good place to hide along the way where he's at right here in the main road. The best he can do, once the supper is finished, is lean back against the tube walls and try to get some sleep. Early night on the first night for the first encounter at night, and as with other nights I roll a d4, and this time I roll a 1. Masenko wakes, not suddenly, but he realizes where he is and his eyes blur open. His head is still spinning. Not good. Wait a second. Didn't he go to sleep on the other side of the road? How did he get on this side? No, he hasn't moved. Stress builds to 3 points, and I roll a 2d10. I roll a 12. Although he isn't panicking, Masenko still feels confused about which direction he's facing, or which way he needs to go in the morning. I roll a d6 notice check. It's a d6 notice check plus wisdom check. I roll an 11. He realizes he hasn't moved, and the direction he was planning on traveling in the morning hasn't changed. It was all just these tubes messing with his head. He goes back to sleep. Once more a d4. I roll a 2. Although his sleep is troubled, Masenko is able to finish out the night in relative peace. As the sun comes up over the horizon, he wakes groggily. His head is killing him today. First things first, he swaps his oxygen tank and then eats some breakfast. Food seems to help, but his head is still throbbing. Every sound seems to reverberate in the tube, and it's magnified by his headache. He stands up and gathers his things, knocking another arrow. He squints into the rising sun. Now for the morning encounter. I roll a d6. It's a 4. Despite his terrible headache, Masenko makes good time and has no issues traveling. Before mid-morning, he sees a biosphere off in the distance along the route he's taking. God only knows what biosphere this is or what it used to be. Because even from here he can see that the dome has caved in. Huge jagged pieces of glass reach toward the skylight, some horrible mountain range. This is it. This is where he will find the right to his father's chiefdom. Suddenly his head doesn't hurt as much anymore. Now towards the biosphere. By the time Masenko reaches the entrance to the biosphere, his headache has returned. The excitement that he first felt had passed to a certain level of dread. He reached the airlock well before lunch, eyeing the airlock. He doubts very seriously the doorway is unlocked. I roll a d4 to see what sort of state the airlock is in. 1, it is locked. 2 or 3, it's jammed. 4, it's unlocked. I roll a 1, so it's locked tight. Damn, Masenko thinks to himself. He begins rummaging through his pack for anything that might help. The only thing that he can find that potentially might help would be his bone knife at his side. He figures it's worth a try. Because of the difficulty in not using the correct tools, I set the DC at 10 for a dexterity and fix check. This would be a net 0 roll for him, except since he doesn't really have the right tools, I'm also giving him a disadvantage of -1. I roll a 7 -1, a 6. Not surprisingly, the door lock doesn't give. Maybe after all these years the door has weakened, so as to say a DC 10 strength plus exert check. I roll a 10, but he gets a -1 from no exert skill. The door creaks under his weight, but it doesn't budge. DC 10 notice and wisdom check to see if there might be a way out of the tube. I roll a 6. There's no way out. Tension's rising. He's going to run out of time. This day is critical. He begins backtracking. This time, despite his headache, he runs. A 1d8 for an encounter, since he's in known territory. I roll a 2. By lunchtime, he is back to the crossroads. He doesn't stop to guess. He turns right. Early afternoon on the second day. I roll a d6. It's a 1. Faster and faster he runs. He's on a side tube for sure. The weeds are starting to grow up, and the path looks older and denser now. He continues to run through them. He doesn't have time to dally anymore. After a while, as he's approaching the small biosphere that he sees off in the distance, he notices his pack slider. Oh no. A tear in his pack. He must have torn it in some of the brambles. All of his food's missing. No time to stop. He keeps pushing on until he arrives at the small biosphere. Without stopping, he throws his weight against the door and it turns the knob. It opens. Masenko stops gasping in the airlock. Stops and begins gasping in the airlock. He tests the door into the biosphere as he's resting. Sure enough, it's unlocked. He steps into the biosphere. He can't wait any longer. This biosphere, though, is different. It doesn't appear as a large prison in the center, as most of these biospheres do. Instead, it looks like some sort of a series of small buildings, 3 in 2 rows. It's small enough that he can see other airlocks leading down other tubes across the biosphere. No time to linger. I roll a d4 for the encounters along the way. I roll a 2. Everything within the biosphere is heavily grown. There are breaks in the biosphere wall, but otherwise the biosphere appears to be relatively intact. As he approaches the buildings, he notices a sign in the pathway. Logistics Barracks. Interesting. He's never seen any buildings like this before. I roll a wisdom check with a DC of 8. I roll a 8, but he has a -1, so 7. Masenko can't tell if there's been anything or anyone in here lately. Each of the buildings is a single story. He steps into the first building on the right, as the door to this building has long since either rotted off or been removed. His eyes adjust to the darkness. After a few moments, he begins exploring. Rows and rows of ancient computers line the walls. Most of the monitors have been destroyed, but some are still intact. Masenko figures he could bring back some circuit boards, but given how strapped he is now for time, he decides this will need to be a future gathering place for supplies. DC 8 notice wisdom check. I roll a 10 minus 1, so a 9. He succeeds in the notice check. Masenko sees something under the pile of rubble. He lifts it up and it's a book. Somehow the paper of the book is still barely legible, in some areas at least. It looks like notes on shipping logs, information on all kinds of goods traded from prison world to prison world, and also some labor for goods and services off of Thorun. Although it's pretty interesting, this isn't really what he came and wouldn't really be a trial-worthy treasure. He drops the book and moves on to the next building. This one's locked. He doesn't have time for a finer way of doing things. DC 8 strength and exert check. 6 minus 1. The door doesn't budge. He moves on to the next building. This third building is unlocked. The door is in place, but the handle turns easily and opens freely. Surprisingly so. This building looks like it once was some sort of an office of some sort. Maybe the primary office? Offices from 1,000 years ago don't really hold many valuable items for this day and time. DC 6 wisdom and notice check. Another 10, minus 1, another 9. Rifling through some of the drawers in the bottom of one of the drawers, it's a note that catches Masenko's eye. It reads, "If we don't hear back from any of the other worlds soon, we will need to utilize the private ships. There are more than enough ships for all of the executives, their staff, and their families. We will wait until October. The writing is illegible from here on." Masenko stares at the paper for a bit. If there were more than enough ships... He pushes the remnants of a chair out of the way, just a few pieces of metal bolted together by rusty bolts. He begins going through the other drawers in earnest now. Maybe there are some ships to get off the planet still? It is a while that he is looking through some of the old crumpling papers, and then he hears it. A stick breaks outside the door that he had left open to the building. In one smooth motion, Masenko picks up his bow, readjusts the arrow that he had knocked before. He stays low behind the desk and peeks under the table. He can see a bipedal creature, or a person, step into the doorway and push the door open a bit. Masenko knows that none of his chiefdom would be here. It is forbidden. He must assume that this person is a threat. I roll a dexterity sneak check for Masenko. Snake eyes. Minus 1. 1 total roll. Whatever is in the doorway rolls an 8 to detect Masenko. The intruder steps into the building and closes the door behind it, obviously realizing that Masenko or something is in here. Combat starts. Roll for initiative. Masenko rolls a 7 plus 1, an 8. The intruder rolls a 6. Masenko, still behind the table, pops up, draws his bow in one smooth motion, and fires. The person in front of him has face paint similar to some kind of cannibal tribe. He's heard of these before, and that they often paint their faces. Attack roll is 19 plus 1 attack bonus, plus 1 dex. The arrow flies true and strikes the cannibal square in the chest. I roll a 1d6 plus 1 for damage. A 4, plus 1, 5 hit points of damage. Another incredible strike by one of the brothers. The arrow buries deep into the cannibal's chest, and a look of stunned bewilderment passes over his face before he falls backward against the closed door, sliding down the door to come to a sitting position. Blood slowly oozing out of his chest. Just a meta note, but I actually rolled a 5 hit points on this cannibal, so Masenko was able to one-shot him. Masenko jogs over to the man, and he finally pulls the arrow from his chest. Just in time, the lights go out of his eyes. Masenko quickly rummages through the man's gear. Some food, good, he needs it. He quickly eats some food with one hand as he continues to rummage with the other. He also finds a pendant in some stonework around the man's neck. A skull and a moon. Strange. Masenko pockets the pendant. He checks the man's spear. Not of bad make. Could be useful for the tribe, but he can't afford the unnecessary weight. Checks the man's oxygen tanks. He has 2 tanks full and 2 tanks empty. He's on his 3rd tank. He's been traveling almost 3 full days to get here. Their biosphere must be far away, Masenko thinks to himself. He straps one of the oxygen tanks to his belt, and he drags the body into the building by the feet and closes the door. He returns to his rummaging through the desk. By now, the sun is starting to set. He can see it through the window of the building. Nothing more of value is found. He takes the piece of paper and folds it into one of his pockets. Then he slips out the doorway. Now he's nervous. If there's one cannibal here, there might be more. He eases to the corner of the building and peers around. For good measure, without knowing if anything's near him, let's roll a sneak and a dexterity check. A 7. Now let's roll a notice wisdom check. A DC is 8. And Masenko rolls an 8 minus 1, so a 7. Masenko doesn't see anything out of the ordinary. He does notice bent weeds, which probably signified where the cannibal came from. He scans in that direction for any movement. Seeing nothing, he moves across the small opening of the courtyard to the next building. In the other row, this first door is unlocked too. DC 8 strength and exert check. Double 6s. Masenko is still hyped and up on adrenaline from the previous fight. He slams his weight into the door and it flies open. He can tell this building hasn't been entered in an eternity, maybe not even since the scream. In this room he finds maps. Lots and lots of maps. Biospheres of all sorts, routes to each. This is a huge find. He scans through the piles of maps and picks out a few in particular of value. Notice and wisdom check to see what all he finds. 9 minus 1 is 8, so actually a pretty good roll. Masenko finds a few things. Primarily among them is the maps of all the biospheres in the northwest hemisphere and in the southwest hemisphere. He rolls these two maps, and sticks them into a tube he found in one of the desks. Then, and potentially even more important, he finds a map of launch sites in the northwest hemisphere. Specifically, he notices that there's one that has a single dotted line leading to it from another biosphere. This has to be the private hangar. He rolls the map into another tube and ties both tubes to his back. Just as he does, a shadow steps into the doorway. Immediately, Masenko realizes it's another cannibal. This one is about the same size as the other, wearing a bone-woven breastplate and a white war paint all over its face. Combat begins. Masenko rolls a 2 plus 1 on his initiative, and the cannibal rolls a 2. It seems as if they are both equally surprised to find one another, but Masenko reacts slightly quicker. He's about 15 meters away from the doorway. He picks up his bow, nocks it, and draws an arrow. 8 plus 2 equals 10. The cannibal ducks the arrow and charges at Masenko. He rolls a natural 1. As the cannibal gets to Masenko, he jabs with his spear, and Masenko slaps the attack away. As soon as he does, the cannibal seems to lose grip on his weapon, and it skips across the floor. Masenko draws another arrow and aims point blank at the cannibal's face. The cannibal holds up his hands in surrender. Since we haven't really established how Masenko will react in situations like this, I roll a d4. Evens, and he attempts to parlay with the cannibal. Odds, and he takes a shot. I roll a 1. Masenko's eyes tense and he releases the arrow. He's had one too many friends get killed by raiders, bandits, and cannibals. He's not going to trust this guy. 14 plus 2 beats the AC 14 cannibal. 2 damage. Seeing the tensing in Masenko's eyes gave the cannibal just enough reaction to dodge slightly out of the way. The arrow skidded across the cannibal's cheek, tearing through his ear, and not landing the killing blow that Masenko had been hoping for. Now the cannibal dives at Masenko. He swings his fist at Masenko's face, hard. I roll an 11 for an attack roll. Masenko steps back and avoids the punch easily. He drops his bow and draws the bone knife at his waist. I roll for an attack. A 19, plus 1 for attack bonus, minus 1 because he has no stab skill. I roll for damage. 4 damage. Masenko buries the knife in the cannibal's lower neck. Blood sprays everywhere as the man gurgles and grips Masenko's shoulder, trying to push him away. His eyes are wide with fear as Masenko lowers him to the ground easily. Before long, the second cannibal is dead. Masenko searches the body quickly. It's almost dark. Another skull and moonstone pendant. Another oxygen tank. For food, this one has some jerky, but Masenko wasn't hungry now. In fact, he was about ready to throw up from what he had ate before, and all the killing and the blood that he'd spilt. He has what he came for. These maps are definitely worth the trip. Even if it does earn him the succession he desires, he would at least be able to help the clan out. He sheathes his knife, grabs his bow, draws the arrow. His brother. Masenko is halfway out the door when he stops dead in his tracks. He'd been so wrapped up with his own troubles that he hadn't even thought about his brother. He said a quick prayer for his brother, hoping and praying that maybe, just maybe, his brother will survive. And then he begins trotting towards the entrance of the biosphere. At this point, he's extremely tired. He's been running most of the last 2 days. He needs rest, but he knows that he has at least to make it back to the crossroads before he can rest for the night. I roll a d4 to see if there's any other cannibals in the darkness of the biosphere. A 3. Masenko pushes through his exhaustion, forcing himself forward. Because he's pushing himself so hard, he now has disadvantage on any physical activities, including combat. He arrives safely at this biosphere entrance and rushes through, no sign of any cannibals. He realizes he hasn't stopped to wipe the blood of the second cannibal off his face, hands and chest. He can see that they've dried black on his clothes. He hopes he doesn't run into anybody along the way, or he'd have a hard time explaining himself. I roll a d4 to see if there's any encounters on his way to the crossroads. I roll a 2. By the time Masenko gets to the crossroads, it's almost midnight. If he gets some rest now, he can have enough energy to make it the entire way tomorrow and be home before the following midnight. Or he can try to push through, risking total exhaustion and a dangerous run and the dangers along the way. I roll a d4 to see what he decides. Evens and he rests, odds and he continues. A 3. Masenko can't afford not to make it back. After a few moments to catch his breath, standing in the middle of the crossroads, he begins trotting toward home. Early morning. I roll a d4, a 3. A few hours after leaving the crossroads, the sun rises. He thinks he's running. Yeah, he's running. Or rather, jogging. His mind is getting muddy now from how tired he is. Maybe he should have just went to the first crossroad. Then again, he wouldn't have gotten this valuable information if he'd settled. No, he had to push through. Late morning. Now the sun is getting up in earnest. And we'll be rolling a d6 again. I roll a 2. Masenko can't seem to bring himself to run anymore. He is walking, or stumbling, forward. He thinks he can still make it back in time if he just walks for a bit. Lunch. Still pushing forward, he doesn't stop for lunch. At this point, he isn't sure he can run the rest of the way, so he needs every moment he can for travel. I roll a d6. A 4. The sun is at its zenith, but clouds block it out. Rain begins to saturate the tube. Small cracks allow for water to fall through. He wouldn't mind some water, but he had none now. Even so, this water would be tainted from the toxic air, without it being run through some sort of a purifier, that is. He continues on. Early afternoon. Off in the distance he sees the first crossroads he came to. I roll a d6. I roll a 6. He feels rejuvenated. He's almost home. He starts to jog again. His feet feel as if they had bricks tied to them, but he pushes on. Late afternoon. He passes the crossroads without a second look. He has to hurry. Another d6 and I roll a 2. It's definitely getting darker now. It isn't as easy to see in the tubes. Periodically he stumbles as he's trying to catch himself from falling. Almost there, he thinks to himself, and he keeps pushing forward. Then, as darkness is crowding around him, he sees off in the distance the Honocles biosphere, home at last. He's dreaming. He can see himself walking through the airlock and collapsing. A crowd of onlookers rushing to him and picking him up. They carry him on their backs to the village. Hannibal. He just passed through the other doorway. He hears one of the people in the crowd yell over the others. Hannibal's hurt really badly, actually, but he at least is able to walk. He can't tell whether that was the voice of some other villager or if it was his. He can't tell anymore. Finally, everything goes dark. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. In the next episode, we'll see what the verdict is from the trials, and we will continue and watch how the path for the Honocles seems to unfold for us. If you do like the story, give me a like, a subscribe. If you don't, leave me a comment and tell me what I can do to make it better. I appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a good night. Bye.